is the keynote speaker, and he is an experienced security professional and author who has made it his mission to raise the standards of the security industry to ensure that every officer, client, and company operates in an environment of trust, fairness, and integrity. John's presentation today is going to be on the structural pressures in the security industry, and this presentation looks at the factors causing harm and instability in the security industry. So I'm going to now turn the present screen over to John.
Thank you, Roy. Let me just set things up my side. Good day. Before I get started, I'd like to thank our host, the Canadian Association for Security Professionals, and bringing this conference together and creating a platform where discussions like this can happen. Events like this require vision, commitment, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to contribute to the conversation today. Before we get into the structural side of this discussion, I'd like to briefly share how I ended up in the private security sector. Like many people in this industry, my journey began in the military. After leaving the army, I started looking for opportunities in the private security sector. On the surface, this seemed like a natural transition. The skills were transferable, the environment was familiar, and the industry itself was clearly growing. But what I discovered fairly quickly was that navigating the private security industry as a veteran wasn't always straightforward. There were certainly good companies out there, professional organizations doing excellent work and building strong reputations. But there were so many situations where it was difficult to distinguish between companies that were genuinely valued professionalism and those that were trying simply to fill positions for the next contract cycle. For someone coming from the military environment, where structure, leadership, and accountability are very clear, that lack of transparency could make a transition more difficult than it needed to be. And I began to realize that my other veterans were experiencing the same challenge. Talented people leaving the armed forces, people with discipline, operational experience, and a strong sense of responsibility were entering the security industry without a clear way of identifying which companies were stable, well-run organizations where they could build long-term careers. That experience ultimately what led me to found Dynamic Reactions. The idea was simple: to build a company that placed professionalism, stability, and trust at the center of how we operate, and to make it easier for veterans and experienced professionals to transition into the security roles, with organizations that value those same standards. And that experience, transitioning from the military into the private security sector and seeing both strengths and structural challenges within the industry, is really what shaped the perspective I'm about to share with you today. Because I eventually realized that many of the challenges people experience in this industry is not caused by individuals or even individual companies. They were created by the structures that shape how the industry operates. Around the world, the private security sector is expanding faster than ever before. Demand for security is rising across infrastructure, transportation, healthcare, energy, and public spaces. And yet, in many markets, something unusual is happening at the same time. As the industry grows, the structural stability behind it is shrinking. That contradiction is not accidental, it's structural. This is not a criticism on individuals, and it's not an attack on companies, and it's not a regulatory complaint. This is a discussion about incentives. Across multiple countries, across different legal systems, political environments, and procurement models, the private security sector is beginning to show very similar pressure patterns. Different jurisdictions, different regulatory frameworks, and different political systems, but the same economic signals. And when completely different markets start producing the same outcome, we're no longer dealing with coincidence. We're dealing with structure. Markets behave rationally. Industries respond to signals. And the security sector is responding exactly as it has been instructed to respond. Because markets do not produce stability or instability by accident. They produce whatever the incentives reward. And that raises an important question for all of us in this room. Are we rewarding the outcomes we actually want? If we look internationally, we can see some of the patterns emerging. In the United Kingdom, prolonged price-weighted procurement has reshaped large public sector security contracts. In Australia, sustained pricing pressure has driven consolidation cycles across the industry. And in parts of the United States, major infrastructure and security contracts are often operating on extremely narrow margins. Different countries, different regulatory systems, but the same structural pressures. What makes this especially important is that these patterns are not emerging in one type of market alone. They are appearing in markets that different licensing systems, different labor models, different regulatory cultures, and different procurement frameworks. Some are more heavily regulated, some are more commercially driven. Some have stronger institutional safeguards. Others operate in with greater market flexibility, and yet the pressure points look remarkably similar. Don't you think that it tells us something very important? It suggests the core issue is not simply geography, and it's not simply regulation. It is the incentive structure sitting underneath the market. Because when very different systems begin to produce the same behaviors, market compression, margin compression, workforce instability, reduced training investment, and reactive operating models, we're looking at something deeper than local policy. We're looking at a structural pattern. And structural patterns require structural solutions. And one of the strongest signals reshaping the industry comes from procurement. In many procurement systems, price carries the greatest weight. Security services are often treated as commodity rather than risk mitigation infrastructure. And the dominant selection criteria becomes the lowest compliant bid. On the surface, this appears rational. Budgets must be managed. Procurement must be transparent. Competition must exist, but when price becomes the loudest signal, the market adapts accordingly. Margins compress. And when margins compress in a labor-intensive industry, downstream consequences are inevitable. Let me give you an example. Not too long ago, I was speaking to a site supervisor on a large commercial property. I asked him what the biggest operational challenge on the site was. He didn't mention technology, didn't mention equipment. He said the hardest part was simply keeping experienced officers on the contract. Because every time the contract went out to tender, the price dropped a little further. And when the price dropped, margins dropped. And when the margins dropped, experienced officers slowly moved on to find more stable work. The risks at the site didn't change. The people walking through the doors didn't change. But the stability behind the security service did. And that illustrates something important. If we treat security as a commodity, the market will deliver commodity security. And this is where the challenge begins, because commodities, by definition, are interchangeable. One unit is essentially the same as another. The only meaningful difference becomes price. But effective security is not interchangeable. It depends on experienced people who understand the environment they're protecting. It depends on officers who recognize patterns of behavior, supervisors who know their teams, and organizations that build long-term knowledge about the sites and communities they serve. Professional security is built on continuity. When officers remain on site long enough to understand the environment, when supervisors develop relationships with their clients, when organizations invest in training because they know their teams will be there next year. Those are the conditions where security becomes proactive rather than reactive. But when contracts change frequently and margins become compressed, that continuity becomes harder to maintain. And when continuity disappears, security becomes transactional rather than professional. That is the risk of treating security purely as a commodity. Margins compress, training budgets shrink, supervision ratios tighten, and turnover increases. Leadership bandwidth becomes thinner. None of these are happening because people stop caring. It happens because organizations are responding rationally to economic signals. This is not incompetence, this is mathematics. When margins become unsustainable, organizations stop thinking long-term and strategy becomes survival. Instead of asking, how do we elevate professional standards? Companies start asking, how do we survive to the next contract cycle? Over time, this begins to reshape organizational culture. Professional identity begins to erode. Not because people lack pride in their work, but because the structure stops rewarding professional investment. We begin to see familiar patterns emerge. High workforce churn, minimal compliance mindset, reduced mentoring and leadership development, and organizations shifting from proactive professionalism to reactive compliance. There's a profound difference between compliance and professionalism. Compliance asks a simple question: what is the minimum we must do? Professionalism asks a very different question: what is the standard we stand for? When the economic structure rewards minimum compliance, culture inevitably follows. And once culture shifts in that direction, reversing it becomes very difficult. There's also a structural consequence that follows sustained margin compression, financial fragility, cash flow pressures increases, insurance premiums begin to rise, regulatory scrutiny increases, and eventually some firms reach a breaking point. When that happens, companies sometimes dissolve and re-emerge under new entities. Often this is not criminal, often this is simply structural, but the consequences are real. Continuity is lost. Employees face uncertainty. Clients lose confidence. Insurance providers increase premiums. Regulators respond with additional oversights. And the entire system becomes more complex and more expensive. This creates a feedback loop. Short-term cost optimization, followed by structural instability, followed by rising systemic costs. Procurement systems are often designed to reduce risk exposure. But if the incentives produce instability, risk actually increases. Insurance markets respond, regulators respond, clients respond. And the industry becomes more complicated, more regulated, and more expensive to operate within. At the same time, talent attraction becomes more difficult. Young professionals hesitate to enter an industry perceived as unstable. This also leads to experienced leaders beginning to leave. I see this reflected in conversations happening across the industry every day. I just recently came across a discussion online where people are asking a very simple question. Is it even worth getting your security license anymore. Think about that for a moment. An industry responsible for protecting infrastructure, businesses, and communities now has potential recruits openly questioning whether it's even worth entering the profession. And the responses in the discussion were telling. Many of them weren't criticizing the work itself. They weren't saying the role lacked importance. What they were questioning was the stability of the career behind it. People were asking whether hours would be reliable, whether the company would still hold the contract next year, whether there would be opportunities to grow. And when people start asking those types of questions, it tells us something important. The issue is not whether security work matters. The issue is whether the structure around the work is stable enough to build a career on. Due to this, the industry is slowly losing institutional knowledge, all while demand for security globally continues to grow. This brings us to Canada. Canada is not immune to the pressures we're discussing, but Canada is also not yet locked into the structural patterns that we begin to see in other markets. And this creates an opportunity. Canada currently has several structural advantages. You have strong provincial licensing frameworks that establish baseline standards for entering the profession. You have institutional procurement systems that are capable of evolving and adapting when needed. And importantly, you still have strong culture for professionalism within the industry itself. Across the country, there are companies investing in training, building long-term client relations, and working to develop stable professional teams. That foundation matters because it means the conversation about stability, professionalism, and long-term industry health can happen before structural instability becomes deep embedded in the market. Many industries only start having these conversations after problems have already become systemic. Canada has the opportunity to have the conversation earlier. We can observe what has happened in other jurisdictions. We can study the pressure points that have emerged, and we can adjust our incentive structures before those patterns become entrenched here. This is a strategic advantage, but like any advantage, it only matters if we choose to use it. That combination creates something important, a strategic inflection point. Canada has the opportunity to observe what's already happened in other markets and adjust early. You can study the patterns emerging internationally. You can identify the incentive distortions that have developed. And you can intervene before those patterns become embedded within your own system. So what might recalibration look like? It does not require abandoning competition. Competitive markets are healthy, but it does require refining what procurement systems reward. Instead of focusing almost exclusively on price, procurement frameworks could balance price with measurable stability indicators. For example, training investment per officer, retention rates, supervisor to officer ratios, multi-year contract structures, professional accreditation tiers. These are measurable, they are auditable, and they are transparent. And when stability becomes visible within the procurement evaluation models, stability increases. Markets respond to signals, and procurement signal shapes industry behavior far more than any regulation ever will. There's also a narrative shift that needs to happen within the industry itself. Security is risk infrastructure. We do not procure aviation solely based on hourly labor rates. We do not procure fire protection by selecting the cheapest staffing model. We evaluate resilience, capability, continuity. Security deserves the same framing. Because when security falls, the consequences are not administrative, they're human. Let me close with this. The security sector is not broken, it's responding. Markets respond to signals. If cost is the loudest signal, cost will dominate. If stability, professionalism, and continuity are rewarded, the market will adapt accordingly. Canada now has a choice. You can replicate the race to the bottom cycles already visible in other markets and let cost be the loudest signal, or you can deliberately design incentives that reward stability and professionalism. Because the future of the security industry will not be decided by technology. It will not be decided by regulation alone. It will be decided by the incentives we design. So the only real question is which signals to amplify. The incentives we design today will determine the industry we inherit tomorrow. Stability creates trust. Trust creates longevity. Longevity enables professionalism. Professionalism strengthens national resilience. Before I finish, I want to leave you with one final thought. Much of what I've spoken about today didn't come from theory. It came from conversations, experiences, and patterns I came across while researching and writing Sold to the Lowest Bidder. The more I looked into the pressures facing the private security sector, the clearer it became that many of the challenges we see today are not isolated problems. They're part of a wider system that has slowly been pushed into the wrong direction. This speech has only touched on a small part of what I discovered during the process. The deeper story, the decisions, the pressures, and the consequences shaping the sector are all explored in much greater detail in the book. My hope in writing it was simple, to start more honest conversations about where the industry is today and where it could go if we start making better decisions moving forward. Because ultimately, the future of the sector won't be decided by one contract, one company, or one moment. It's shaped by the choices we all make. Thank you.